Hello, happy Friday. Welcome to remote learning for 828. Yesterday we did our e-learning day, which was about the water cycle that will be due sometime next week. It shouldn't be too hard for you to complete it because we did notes on it Wednesday, and then you had a video going over the water cycle on Thursday. So wasn't too many questions. I hope you didn't have too many problems with it. If you did have any issues with it, make sure you email me or shoot me a message on Canvas. Today, we're going to be talking about the environment and human interactions with it, how the way we live and how humans act, how they play a role in the environment and how it has changed. So first, we are going to talk about types of resources in the environment. So there are three types of resources that we have to talk about. One is natural resources, then we have renewable resources and non-renewable resources. So a natural resource is a useful material found in the environment. These are things that people depend on and can be divided into two types, renewable and non-renewable resources. So a renewable resource is a resource that Earth or people can replace. So example of this would be fish, plants, soil. These are all things that can be replaced or replenished. When you go fishing, you don't completely deplete the lake or pond of the fish. They naturally reproduce. Same with trees. If you cut trees down in a organized fashion, then they can regrow in a process so that you're not completely depleting an area of all of their trees. Same with farming. Farming is an example of this, the way that we use certain crops to make sure that the soil is rich with minerals so that we can keep using that same soil over and over again, and the way that we use different crops and cut down crops and at certain times is an example of a renewable resource. A non-renewable resource is a resource that cannot be replaced in a relatively short period of time. So an example of this would be fossil fuels or certain minerals that are found deep in the earth. So these are things that we can't naturally reproduce in the same amount of time that we use them. So think about fossil fuels. We have to dig really far down. It takes a really long time to let fossil fuels form, and then we use them so fast that we're naturally running out of these resources, and so they become non-renewable. So, for example, fossil fuels are formed over millions of years from plant and animal matter deep in the ground, and they're used for everything from energy, plastics, chemicals, power sources, while animals are formed through natural reproduction and only require water and food. And we really only use these for food, sometimes agricultural labor, and clothing. So you think sheep's wool used to make certain clothing. The foods that we eat, animals are used in that. There are processes that, when we use natural resources, processes that do have another impact on the environment, but we're going to talk about that later. So we talked about fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are non-renewable resources formed over millions of years. These examples of these are coal, natural gas, and petroleum as the main fossil fuels that we do use. When non-renewable resources such as fossil fuels are used up, they are gone. So sources of energy are important for human activity. Some sources, such as wind and sunlight, are renewable. Today we mostly rely on non-renewable energy. However, we are trying to find energy alternatives in the form of more renewable green energy. We talked about how the resources that we use play an impact on the environment, and how certain resources, such as non-renewable resources, have a bigger impact on the environment than renewable resources, and how if we use more green methods like safer or alternative energy methods, that we can have less of an impact on the environment. Another way that we impact the environment is land use. So if you think about 300 years ago, the way that we used land is a lot different than the way we use land today. So a lot of the land that we used was for farming and hunting and agricultural purposes, and now it's less so farming, hunting, and agriculture, and more for industrial purposes or major cities rather than small farming towns. So uh, another way that land use changed was colonization. So as people came towards the Americas or places in Southeast Asia, Australia, Africa, as colonists moved towards these areas, they changed the way that people use the land. And so they brought in new crops and new ways of farming to the Americas, Africa, Australia. And these new ways led to dramatic changes the in the environment. And so they changed the land from what it was used for cropland and then livestock pasture. So that played a role in changing how land was used and played an impact on the environment. And then if you think about 13 colonies were all on the coast, eventually as more colonists came, they had to move further west. And so we see them spreading out even more and changing more of the environment. And then as that happened, populations grew and grew and grew. And so we started to play more of an impact, and it grew exponentially over time. And we see that cultivate in the birth of the modern city. So as the Industrial Revolution comes around in the 1800s, people leave farming communities and flock towards large cities in the north and then later in the south and Atlanta. So Chicago, New York, Pennsylvania, places in Pennsylvania like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia are the birth of our large American cities, our modern cities. And so as more people come towards these cities, the amount of resources that are needed for those cities and the way that people live in those cities and work in those cities change. So what was once a sustainable method of living, small towns, farming, using the resources that you have in a sustainable fashion, changed to mass production, the use of factories, the use of large machinery for farming rather than more simple older methods using agriculture and livestock to help you with farming. They then use machines, and then those get mass produced and sent towards modern cities. And modern cities continue to grow rapidly, and so the amount of resources that we use grows rapidly with that. So another example is the birth of the suburb. So as the modern American city grew, and the amount of industrialization and factories inside of cities, because modern cities revolved around factories. Factories were built, people had to live close to the factory to work there. So as the modern American city grew and more factories were used in inner cities, people found the inner cities to be dirty and gross, and people lived in squalor, and so they wanted to move outside of the modern American city. And so you found the birth of the American suburb. So suburbs are a residential area on the edge of a city or large town. So they get a lot of the resources and benefits of being by an American city, but they don't have to live in the dirty inner city areas, and they were able to move out. So if you look at a map of most modern American cities, you'll see that it almost looks kind of like a target. And so the center is where all the factories are, and then just outside of that is going to be where a lot of the people who work for the factories live. And then outside of that will be your suburbs and more desirable places. And so as the rings get away from the inner city, they become a little bit more desirable. So if you look at a place like Chicago or Indy, you'll see a lot of the major businesses in the center, and then around that will be the people who work at those businesses. And then outside of that will be suburbs where more wealthy people will live. And so just as that happens, You see people having and owning more land in suburbs, and the modern American suburb using up more land in a non-renewable fashion, as opposed to what we would have done 300 years ago or 200, even 200 years ago in farming and renewable resources and sustainable methods. So we have talked about our impact on the environment, both in the resources we use and the way that we use land. So we're going to explore how our impact can be both negative and positive in certain ways. So first, we're going to talk about how we extract resources. So think about cutting down forests for wood, or drilling for oil and deep sea oil drills. So those are both ways that we extract resources. So cutting down forests for wood, if they're not done in a responsible way or done carefully, that can result in deforestation. So if you think about places like the rainforest, cutting down lots of the rainforest very quickly and not replanting trees causes deforestation. And so that can be either the result of just improper business practices or poor regulation on how businesses interact with the environment. Another way that extraction can be negative is through accidents or mistakes in things like oil spills. So the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago resulted in a large amount of oil that negatively impacted not just the water in the Gulf of Mexico, but also all of the animals that were in the Gulf of Mexico. So there are lots of pictures of ducks covered in oil. So one thing that you still see today because of that is the duck covered in oil on the bottle of Dawn dish soap. So Dawn dish soap was found to be useful in getting the oil off of ducks, and so they use that picture on their bottle of dish soap, and you can still see that today. So spills in deep sea oil drills and deforestation can cause a large change in biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of living things in a region or ecosystem. So cutting out all the trees can destroy the homes of all the animals and bugs and plants that would live in that area. And so as you get rid of trees, or as you have an oil spill in a large body of water, you can negatively impact not just the land, but also destroy the homes of all those animals, and in a way potentially kill off an entire species of animals. So those are both examples of pollution, but pollution is also occurs with cars and factories and the way that we use resources. So you think about car exhaust as an example of pollution, but more pollution actually comes from large businesses and factories rather than your car. So pollution is waste that makes the air, soil, or water less clean. So an example would be farmers use chemicals called fertilizers and pesticides to help plants grow or kill pests. These chemicals can help farmers produce more food, but they can also harm the environment by causing pollution. So pollution is an example of spillover, which just means that pollution has an effect on everyone, not just those who commit the act. So a factory or a business polluting the environment, so BP causing that oil spill, doesn't just affect BP, it also affects everyone near the Gulf of Mexico, and not even just that, but anyone who uses any sort of business that goes through the Gulf of Mexico. Everything had to shut down, and so it takes a lot longer for normal day-to-day things to get done just because of something like an oil spill, or pollution, or just poor business practices. So now I want to talk about what we can do, or what potentially we can do to negate or try and fix any of these negative impacts we have. So we can also have positive impacts on the environment. So one way is using renewable resources, or trying to limit the amount of non-renewable resources that we use. So instead of using plastic bags, using something that you can use over and over again, bringing your own bags to the grocery store, an example of limiting the amount of single-use plastic that you can use, using a renewable or reusable mask that you wash rather than using a disposable mask, is also an example that you may think about more commonly today. So we have personal responsibility, but then we also have using things like green energy. So using light bulbs that last a lot longer or more eco-friendly isn't a way that we can use green energy, but also just uh, wind energy, solar energy, electric cars are examples of green energy that we can see in our day-to-day lives that have a positive impact on the environment, because as we use those, we don't need to rely on fossil fuels as much, and so we can deplete or lessen the amount of non-renewable resources we use. Another thing is just safer business practices. So lessening the amount that factories are allowed to produce pollution, or more stringent rules on businesses, is a way that pollution can be lessened and we can have a better impact on the environment. I talked earlier about personal responsibility, but one way that we can do that is through recycling, or just picking up litter that we see on the ground. So if you think about, there's 140 students in 7th grade at New Haven Junior High, and if every person picks up one piece of trash and recycles it, that's 140 things that get recycled every day. Or if we use a renewable bottle, like a good plastic bottle, rather than like a plastic bottle that you just would throw away after you use, if we use a reusable bottle, that's 140 bottles that aren't going to get thrown in the trash or aren't going to be used. And so if every person does that every day, 140 times 180 is, pull out my handy dandy calculator, 140 times 180 is 25,200 plastic water bottles that don't get used for that day. So if we do that just every day during the school year, we can use 25,000 less water bottles. So even if only half of us do that, so divided by 2, that's still 12,600 plastic water bottles that don't get used over just that 1 year. And so if you think just half the people in the 7th grade alone, we could lessen the amount of plastic water bottles that get used by 12,600. So with the extra time that we have, you can continue working on your e-learning. Otherwise, we are done for the day. I hope you have a good weekend. We will start talking, I believe we're going to start talking about Africa, and start talking about our first continent in the next section. So next week, I think we'll be starting talking about our first continent in Africa. Have a nice weekend. If you need any help with anything, let me know. Shoot me a text on Canvas or shoot me an email. Have a nice day. I will see you guys on Monday.